Welcome to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do because, well, this is the second part of our lovely conversation with the founder of Parquet, Sumit Kumar here. Before we talked a lot about the whole business aspect of creating an own software as a service application. Now we come to an at least equal juicy part of the whole conversation.
And don't feel like you need to watch the previous episode if you don't want to, but if you do, definitely go check it out and find some great content there.
Exactly. So let's start with all the technical parts, Nuxt 2 to 3 migration, and some more things we don't want to spoil here. So let's jump into it.
So we've been talking a lot about business side of things. Now let's maybe bring it back to the technical, the Vue stuff. I mean, this is called DejaVue after all. So let's bring it back. So you recently did a Nuxt 3 migration, I hear. How did that go for you?
Well, not well, I'd say. I'm not sure if there's anyone who that migration went well for, but no, it's not fun at all. But it had to be done. We didn't really prioritize it in the beginning, but at some point there is like a point of no return where if you delay it any longer, we tried with Nuxt Bridge and everything, and then things start to break. It's not a good experience. And at some point we said, okay, we drop everything else, and all the entire team basically pushes through it. I don't know, it took us a month or something then of very focused effort after some initial exploration and getting Nuxt Bridge to work, where also Daniel of the Nuxt core team, shout out from my side and very much thank you. He helped us here and there with getting the first pull requests to work. And then we finished it. Now we are there, which is great. But the migration is not fun.
So maybe let's start going roughly through the migration itself. I mean, Parquet started as a Nuxt 2 application, and then obviously when Nuxt 3 came out and the stable release was there, of course the first thought was not like, okay, let's drop everything and migrate over. So this has to be planned nicely. This doesn't take just a couple of hours, of course. So when did you start considering migrating, or had to put first thoughts into moving over, and maybe what stopped you from doing it earlier?
Well, because it doesn't provide any business benefit and no benefit to the customer. Like, obviously you can say, yeah, it's faster and this and that and has more developer productivity, but these are very vague metrics. Some metrics you don't even track. So it's obviously not a priority at all to do this kind of stuff. So if I could avoid it, I would have avoided it, because Nuxt 2 works great. It solved all of our problems. The customer doesn't care at all. So there was no point in migrating. At some point, there is, if support drops and everything, but especially in the beginning, Nuxt 2, I think, came out, 1 year after Vue 3, something like this. So there was a big... Nuxt 3. So there was a big discrepancy where Vue 3 was already out. Then Nuxt 3 came, but the modules, the community modules and all the things we used so many libraries and modules. There was just no support for everything that we used. So it was always like, okay, you can migrate this, but this doesn't work yet. Or you can do this, but this doesn't work yet. So we waited until we thought, okay, everything has moved over at some point. And we also didn't want it to be the first to migrate, because if you run into problems that no one else had, like, how are you able, it's impossible to find solutions except if the core team helps you, but you don't want to be a burden on them as well. Because they are doing this for free. They are doing this open source. You can't expect them to help you. I don't want to expect them to help us. So there was just no reason to upgrade immediately. Only downsides, basically. And
or that it's not even possible, as you mentioned. Like, okay, if you have a lot of libraries you depend on, they don't have a Vue 3 equivalent yet, or they might not have one, then what's the option? Instead of waiting or doing it yourselves, which is also really possible, given that you don't are not a big company and you also have features to ship.
And there are all kinds of things. Then Vue 3 introduced the composition API, and that meant that some libraries or plugins or components, not components, but libraries of Vue 3, they switch to the component API, and that means you can only use them with the component API, and that means you have to rewrite every component because of that migration. And that is not something that is like a lot there, but we noticed this because Vuex, for example, we use Vuex very heavily, and now you have to use the Pinia store, or you should use Pinia store. And everything was centered around that. So you read the documentation, you read the migration, you read what people say online, and you think, like, is Vuex even supported? Like, can I use it? And if I use it, like, where do I get help if I have problems? It seems like it's deprecated from, and I know I might be wrong on this. I'm saying this as someone where I know you two are very into Vue stuff. You know all of that, but I don't. I use, again, Vue is a tool for me. I don't look at it as a hobby to do Vue or to learn Vue or to learn everything about it. I read what I have to read in order to do what I need to do. So even though I might be wrong, it's just when I tried to do it, we had, 10 different pull requests at some point where we tried to migrate or tried to introduce Vue Bridge and stuff just broke everywhere. We also had front-end tests, component tests. They broke, obviously, all of that stuff. It was very chaotic and very, very hard to debug and to find, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it. My team did it with the help of Daniel. We solved some stuff, but at the end of the day, I can definitely say I would have not been capable to migrate, me personally. My team, luckily, was capable to do that.
So what were the what was roughly the timeline, the steps that you tried out or like that maybe didn't work? Because I mean, you said, like, for example, Vuex and Pinia or Options API, Composition API. And while these obviously are big things, I personally at least have seen a couple migrations where people said, like, you know what? Of course, the components that touch Pinia in a way, we have to change them. We have to maybe migrate them over at some point. We maybe have to create a wrapper component that uses the composition API and leave the rest out, but keep, let's say, most things static and avoid all these moving pieces. Was of course very tricky with lots of libraries changing and Vite and Vue 3 and so on and Nuxt modules. But what was your approach, so to say, there to make sure this was as painless or like as less painful as possible, let's say?
So to give context, right, we have about 150,000 lines of code. We use server-side rendering, we use pre-caching, we use the JSON LD module, right, for SEO stuff. We have obviously all the single-page application stuff. We had the progressive web app stuff. We had the Vuex. So we use vValidate extensively in our forms. vValidate was a very hard topic during that migration because we basically had to touch everything for that, everything where it's used. So I would say we use the full power of Nuxt in every regard. We have a lot of dynamic routes, like programmatic routes, thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages, actually, even 100,000s, I think. So yeah, it's a lot that you have to think about and test. And the first step obviously was to go to the Nuxt2 website and look at the migration guide, right? And then you go to the first steps. And this is what we did. Like, we try to prepare as much as possible, but at some point it's like quicksand. You put one step in, and then there is an error, and the solution is, you also do that step. And then there is another error. For that to solve, you also have to do that step. And your pull request is not one step into the Nuxt 3 migration. It's the whole Nuxt migration. Then at some point we said, okay, our foot is already eaten by the quicksand. Let's all jump in and just go through with it. And then we did. We didn't really find good cutoff points where we could say, okay, we can do this part and then ship and then just continue. So we would try to find them, and there were maybe one or two things that we were able to merge into production, continue with our feature development and things like that. And these were good steps into the Nuxt migration. The first thing was to install Nuxt Bridge and have it work. That was the first thing that we shipped. But we, for example, had to do a lot of migration already, like from the test suite and things like that, to make that work. And then at some point there was, again, no return, and we just went through with it. It's also much better now, by the way. We are glad we did it. I also want to say that the migration is painful, but we are very, very happy that we did it.
And of course, I just want to say I hope that won't ever happen again like that in terms of future Nuxt majors. I mean, I'm pretty sure in that. But also we'll talk about Nuxt 4, which is also in a bit. I'm just wondering, back to the Nuxt bridge part. So you got that up and running. How, like you said, you did roughly the migration in almost a month. What do you say timeframe wise? How long did it take you to actually get Nuxt bridge up and running versus let's say the rest of it?
It's hard to say because there was always one developer, someone from the team, like one person, doing this exploration, trying to get it to work, right? It's a whole different game if the whole team is focused on this. Also regarding like cost, or opportunity cost, what you don't do instead. And if only one person is there, they might try this on the side for a few weeks. While then, if the whole team goes at it, you can solve it faster, like in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So that's why it's very hard. We always had there was always a pain or something where we said, okay, we got to do it at some point, and then someone just tried it on the side, tried to get there, called other people for help if they got stuck, or ranted on Twitter, which was mostly me, and trying to get help there. Yeah, so at the end of the day, it took us a couple of months of thinking, but this sounds harder than it actually was. Like, it wasn't like the whole team blocked for a few months. That was not the case. It was always someone trying, lots of frustration, and then it was just, okay, let's do it. Let's migrate everything. Let's get rid of Nuxt Bridge. We migrate everything. We look at all the errors and just fix all of them. And whatever it takes, we do it. And yeah, that was then the migration path.
And now your components are all on Composition API. Okay.
No.
Because as you said, you were like, okay, Options API now use everything in Composition API with Pina, for example, which should also have an Options API support. Yeah. But anyway. So you left.
For example, Tanstack query is something that is only supporting Composition API.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
So whenever we wanted to use that, we transitioned to the Composition API. And like we said in the team, every new component that we write is Composition API. That is something the team decided. I adhere to. I would have voted differently, but not my call anymore. Again, I'm not a main developer anymore. So yeah, everything new is that. We also just recently enabled TypeScript, so optionally, of course, but we start to type new stuff. We start to bring the types from the API to the front end, which is a great thing. Even for me, as someone who would have never, ever done this. I would never have done this, but I know the benefit, I see the benefit, and I'm looking forward when we are there. So we are slowly getting there, and I'm getting more familiar with the Composition API as well. So I'm warming up to it. Me personally, my team loves it, but it's not everything is like we try to rewrite or change only what's necessary to make it work. So most of the code is still Options API, and yeah, but especially new components are Composition API, and we did it in the beginning. We had what was the Vue Composition RP package or something?
Yeah,
so we used the Composition. Yeah, we used that a lot, but there was also a problem for the migration because you had to change stuff, and this was not supported anymore, and
Yeah, so I mean, it's good that you didn't just say, hey, all components, let's move them all over, because obviously that would probably be even more work for, and as you said before, no tangible results. Okay, they're Composition API now, but now what? Are they faster? Well, that 1 millisecond, it doesn't really matter. I really like the Boy Scout principle there in terms of if you touch a component, if you have to implement something, then maybe it's good there to migrate over if it's not 3,000 line component, which theoretically shouldn't exist, but we all know that can happen every now and then, or a big page component. So that totally makes sense. And because otherwise, migrations with 150 lines, 100,000 lines of codes, they would take forever and ever.
And also, like, again, the question is also why migrate them over, right? Like, I don't know if the options API is suddenly bad. I haven't read about it. I only know why the composition API exists, and if these benefits or the downsides of it are, either not important to you or you want to avoid them, then I don't know. The options API is still valid as far as I know, but I see many people advocating for it, and some of the benefits still have to emerge in my head, but other people are seeing it. And this is something, the only thing I can think of where I thought maybe even is wrong on this one. But he's much smarter than me, so I'm sure I will see the benefit at some point that he is. And what I usually know from these front end or from programming in general, solutions like libraries and frameworks, etc., you understand them best if you experience the pain that they solve. And I probably haven't experienced the pain that the composition API is solving for me. Not yet, at least. And at some point I will get there, I'm sure, and I will get it. And again, I'm warming up to it. It's much, much easier, in my opinion, or much more pleasant to use it with the script setup tag instead of having setup as an option. This is something where when it's mixed, it's really painful with the return and everything, and it's
by the way,
chaotic.
You just mentioned, maybe Evan was wrong in that what you just mentioned, composition API without the script setup compiler magic. Evan said in the DejaVue episode actually on that, that this was probably the biggest mistake in terms of Vue 3. So actually, not using it with script setup, and especially people coming over from other frameworks like, hey, new composition API, let's take a look, and then having that like bloated setup function with all the returns and super hard to understand, and what's happening with props and the context. 100%. That's why ideally, if you have to mix them, then probably migrating them over is the better way than like mixing them all together, especially with server-side rendering coming into play there and other issues, or like using composables and then like not the setup function. I've seen a lot of interesting things in the last years. Yeah.
We have a lot of mixed components as well, and they are painful. So that should not. And we only have this mixed components because of libraries like TenStack Query that only support that. Right. While we were using async data a lot because it's great when you do server-side rendering and have stuff pre-rendered and pre-fetched. But now it doesn't work anymore, and we introduced this new framework and TenStack Query, and then you need to use the setup, and it's just. Yeah, it's very messy. But again, new components are very clean. They all use the composition API. And when you use script setup, it's much more pleasant, simply because you don't have to return this. You can structure it a little better. Just today, I was working on something and I was refactoring something. And I like that I immediately saw that, every function, every computed prop, I saw that if it's not used in the template, my IDE shows it to me. Things like that. And I know there are many more benefits that I just haven't experienced yet, especially with TypeScript, especially with like using composables more.
Definitely.
That my team is very proficient in. They use this all the time. I personally have never abstracted anything into a composable yet because I wasn't like, I always thought, adding something into a composable means I want to reuse it. And I couldn't warm up the idea of putting something in the composable just to structure it differently. Like, having not like 1,000 lines of code in one component, but like putting it into a different file via a composable. Like I haven't warmed up to this idea yet. And just scrolling through a large component feels a lot more messy in the composition API because the code is mixed. Like you can structure it by topic, but it's like, how do you structure it with code comment? Like I put code comments in. This is the logic for this. This is the logic for this. Like it doesn't look more structured than the options API for my eyes.
Let's quickly stay there because I think that's really good. Because I heard it quite often, and actually like what a lot of people coming from options API are like, what they're doing is writing / props / data and so on and so on.
But really, okay, I haven't thought about that.
Please don't ignore what I just said. But what would you do in like a normal JavaScript or TypeScript file, not Vue, just like in, I don't know, some API route or so? You probably would create a function. right? Like, hey, this is code that like belongs together, same concern. You put it in a function. And now if you say, hey, this is code that has some stateful logic, right? It also belongs to one concern. You can also put it in a function, and then you put a use in front, and it's a composable, but you don't have to put it in a new file. And that's what Michael and I usually call inline composables. So you keep them in a component, you don't have to reuse them. And it's a bit like functions in JavaScript and TypeScript.
Okay, that's a good idea. I wasn't thinking about inline composables at all yet. And I will actually do that. I have a large component right now that is composable API, and it has waypoints with observers, then it has drop-down logic, then it had blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. I will try this. I will try this actually tonight and see how it works.
I do. So I have an article that I wrote on this, and the link will be in the show notes. And I'm also working on a course for composable patterns and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, just keep that in mind. There'll be some more info on that in the coming weeks.
That's awesome. You can position your tutorial to boomer coders who doesn't like change, and they can they can learn this like me.
Yeah,
but yeah, also that like Michael, as like in Michael's articles, there also made a video about that, like component organization, like with the composition API, like how to put code where and what's a composable and all that. So yeah, all of that is also in the show note, and we'll send it to you after the show as well. Because that's very commonly you all know that like that screenshot or like of the two sides, like the options API and the composition API and the different colored sections. That was like in the docs and in the RFC, where it's like, oh yeah, that's concerned by logic, and that's concerned by like, let's say the structure. And you see like all these scattered colors, like, okay, logic is separate in the options API, especially with big components. You have like in your data function that returns the state, you have like 10 different features and compute it as well, and so on and so on. Well, of course, in the composition API, you can structure it very nicely, and that's the downside, you have to figure out how to structure that. But in a way, that's also part of being a, let's say, quote unquote, good programmer, right? Find a good structure for that in normal JavaScript and TypeScript. Now just making the connection, hey, you can use reusable functions. You just put use in front, they're composables if they have some kind of state, if they take reactive values, and so on and so on.
More freedom means you have more responsibility to do the right thing, but you also have more ways to screw up the code base. And Absolutely. In my opinion, I'm someone who is for very strict rules. Like, this is how we do it. This is the design pattern, and this what I liked about the options API. Mm-hmm. But on the composition API, for example, you mentioned in the docs, right, with the colors and concerns. One thing that like I'm trying to do this, right, but again, I cannot. I can, for example, not collapse. Like I can do this with inline components. I understood now, so I will try this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But imports, they have to be on top, so they are not Correct. Separated by concern. They are still grouped together. Then the next thing is defining refs, right? Const variable whatever equals ref. I feel weird having those scattered across the code, by concern. It's just a pattern that I grew up in and was like pushed in. The variables have to be on top, and so I know I should do this in this new paradigm, but it's hard to change that behavior.
I don't think I've ever thought of that until you brought that up, but I totally know what you mean. That like writing JavaScript is like, oh, put your variables at the top. Always put them at the top. Put them at the top, and so then now I feel weird. Like declaring a variable further down, even if it makes more sense to be grouped somewhere else. Like, it's not a natural way of writing.
Yeah, you define it at the top of the block scope, right? So in the script tag, everything is top level, at least from the refs you define. But if you put them in inline composables, that's why I think this might be a good solution. If you define it in there and return it, then we are getting somewhere.
Exactly, because then you don't have all the global state in a component, but it's really grouped to the feature. You can return them. You basically call them on top. And to actually close the loop here, when we come back to the screenshots, like to a screenshot of options versus composition API, a lot of people, and I have that in workshops a lot, and also made a whole video about it as well. It's like, hey, can we see that unpixel? Because it's always like super like pixelated and everything. And if you take a look at how Evan refactored component was back then from Vue CLI even, he literally did the same. He had all the imports on top. With Nuxt, you have auto imports. So if you use them, if you're a fan of them, they don't need to be all on top, but they don't need to exist. But that's also, that depends a bit on what you like or not like. Then you have basically all your composables called like it was, I don't know, use folder, path, use network, whatsoever. And you have also a hierarchy like, okay, I need the network ref first, and that I pass into another composable. And that composable, I get something out, and that this will go further and further until you have all the parts for the component. And under then, like a bit like the newspaper stuff, like the headlines first, important parts, like the abstract ones, and then you have the functions, like the composables explaining, oh, this is how the network is initialized, this and that. So, and this is what Evan did from the get-go. But I have the feeling a lot of people, also when the composition API was introduced, they were not aware of this is how you should write it. We're like, oh, nice. Reusable, I can extract it. I write a composable, I put it in an extra file, and it's gone, even if you just use it one time. And that's definitely no-go. Like, only abstract it away if you really will reuse it, like, I don't know, notifications, toasts, and whatnot, but not your components' internal functions.
Yeah. That's I think that's a good way to think about it. So for me, inline composables just like they flipped a little switch regarding code structuring for me. I will try this as soon as possible. And reusability, I have to say, when I use a composable that someone else wrote, I can definitely see it. I haven't wrote it myself, and it's still a bit intimidating to me because I'm scared a little bit of, for example, the lifecycle hooks. The rule I was told or read was on mounted hook, for example, only on top level.
Or the composable. That's also fine.
The composable on top level, that's right. But yeah, then there are some composables who use lifecycle hooks in them, and that means I can put them in a lifecycle hook themselves. Like I can do on mounted and then another on mounted that the composable is using, for example. And this sometimes limits how I use them, and it is a mental burden for me to think about this because I do an example in case it's too abstract. If you want to do keyboard shortcuts on a website, right? Then you do a composable for the escape key, and then you use in there a composable for key binding, like binding the events and unbinding the event. And binding the event should happen on mounted hook. So where do you use the on mounted hook? On the outside, where you do use escape key, whatever, or do you use it during the key binding? When it's in the key binding, you can do it, but then at some point you arrive where you want to keybind something and you use it in a different context, and that context has to be in the on-mounted hook or something, right? And then you run into this error. I did. So you need a rule set for structuring your code, and you need to think about this in the beginning. Otherwise, or at least I feel like this, I feel like there is a lot of responsibility to do this right. And it's just intimidating for me to write composables because I don't know how they will be used in the beginning. I know there's one use case here, but it's very hard to understand how they can be nested, etc. And some stuff work and some stuff doesn't work. So if there are rules in place in teams that say there is no lifecycle hook in a composable, for example, right, to avoid this, then I can understand this, but I don't know these rules. I don't know where these best practices are, or if there are best practices for this. We have to find out and see what works. And this is a process that I'm a bit concerned about,
Actually, you're not the first one mentioning that. Like we had Natalia Tepluina on from the core team who wrote big parts of the Vue docs as well. And she's working in GitLab, right? They have like also a huge number of engineers, and they still use the options API. And it was the same part, like composition API is all nice, but the thing is of like finding a good set of best practices and rules is super important. The thing is, they're not the best practice and rules for all, like not for all the same. If you use SSR, it might be different than using a plain Vue application. There might be shared like design patterns and ideas, also like what Michael and I talked about in previous episodes of Michael's course and some other free material as well. But it's true. In terms of the lifecycle hook in the composable, though, it's totally fine to have a lifecycle hook in there and have a lifecycle in the component. Like you can have tons of composables calling these lifecycle hooks. That's fine. You can even have a composable in the composable in the composable, as long as they're always called top level. It's like, okay, a component invokes composable use A. Use A invokes use B, and use B says, oh, at some point on mounted, it's all cool. In a way, that's the beauty of it, that you now actually can share state besides some ugly mixins, that you actually have functions that say, okay, whenever I'm called, that can be in a weird chain of reactions, but still top level in a setup function, even though it's through multiple levels of function execution, my Vue lifecycle will still work. And sometimes I'm just called directly, and that's also okay. So in a way, that can work pretty well. But I agree there have to be some good rule sets and best practices, because otherwise, like, oh, this composable should only be used, like, say, outside of server-side rendering. Then you have to denote that. That's also one thing that is definitely like, how do you express that in the code base? What do you do with that?
Yeah, it's super powerful. And what my team also mentioned to me is that it's so much better than Mixins. And this is what I wanted to say is I never used Mixins. I maybe used Mixins twice or something in like 10 years or something of Vue. I'm not sure. So also, again, a pain that I haven't felt, so I can't see the benefit yet regarding that specifically. But I'm getting around to it. I'm sure.
Definitely. So after the whole Nuxt migration, or maybe during that, have you ever considered switching your tech stack in terms of front-end framework? Because of course, then people think, oh, it's so much work to migrate. Maybe it's better to, like, I don't know, move to Svelte or React or whatnot. And yeah, was it ever on your mind that you feel like maybe that effort could be just a rewrite in a different stack?
So I thought about rewrite in the sense that maybe it's faster to rewrite everything than to, copy the components over, but rewrite the entire app on a fresh Nuxt 3 installation than to do the migration. I thought about that a lot, and we talked about this, but it was never an option at all to move to a different framework. We wouldn't switch away from Vue. I will tell you in a second why. And regarding Nuxt, the Nuxt migration was a little bit of a shake up in the trust in how this works from Nuxt, but I also think the Nuxt team did a great job in like catching that. I think it was very tough. I also think this came from the community feedback to the Nuxt team. They understood and they responded. I think they responded well. And you also said this hopefully never happens again. I trust the Nuxt team that this doesn't happen like this again. That basically very late after the Vue 3 release, you can even upgrade, but then there are the community is so far behind that as soon as the community is ready, the support drops, for example. So we felt like there was never the right time to do that. And I feel like everyone learned from that. The community, the Nuxt team, everyone. So I think that was really nice. But at that point where this trust was a little bit shaken, I looked at other SSR frameworks on top of Vue. And the only one I found was still in development. I thought it was really nice and how we did things, but it was not battle tested, right? It was very in the beginning. And again, I'm not looking for a solution to toy with. I'm looking for a battle tested solution that I can build a business on. So yeah, I don't like to try stuff. I want something boring that everyone uses that just works, basically. And that is also where we get to why did we stick to Vue and Nuxt in this case, and it was not an option to switch. Purely business perspective. Everyone on my team knows it. Every developer that we hired knows it, and the customer doesn't care. And there is no benefit for us in switching, only costs. It only costs us time. It costs us stuff to learn new things. And and the preference from my personal point of view, even though that is not the deciding factor today, but is still there for the syntax of Vue, for the way Evan and the team and everyone that is like working on Vue and Nuxt is deciding stuff. Like I'm much more aligned with their point of view and how things should be and where things are going than, for example, with React or some other frameworks. But all of the meta frameworks, like I haven't even looked at them. Again, there is no point in learning new frameworks for me right now. But again, it's a team decision at the end, but there are some things that I would block. For example, I don't block that the team is going for TypeScript on the front end or going for the composition API, etc. It's their call. But if they say we want to rewrite everything in React, I would block that. There is no benefit that they can convince me of, and I would still have a lot of the downsides. I need to maybe hire new people. Everyone has to learn it. We have to rewrite everything, and we would be like, I don't know, half a year or 1 year busy without benefit to the customer. And this is not an option at all.
Totally makes sense. I think that's also the problem a lot of other people have with their projects. And I think like a problem in terms of people using other frameworks saying, hey, let's say I use React. I always use React. We have a project in React, and of course you can't just rewrite it to Vue, do like half a year or a year of like halting the business, even if your developers say, hey, Vue is so much more fun, it's more joy. So obviously that's not a way. Have you though thought about maybe, I don't know, smaller pet projects in the company being spun up with other frameworks? So like, hey, okay, just like try it out, test it. Maybe that's the way to go. Can also, of course, be in other directions, as for example, Vue is lacking like a React Native. So for a native application, well, there are other solutions. So I'm curious which results you have there.
Yeah, that is a good question. So I've seen many approaches in my career, and I also think I made some mistakes on that front as well. If it depends on how well it has to be maintained, like what happens a lot in teams everywhere. I would say in every team this happens, and it's totally normal. Is that there is a young or junior developer coming in, very excited about a specific framework, has opinions, knows it best, like knows it better than the people working on the team, but also it's the best thing he knows. And they come on and they want to rewrite everything, or they want to have a new app, and that has to be React because framework, whatever, Vue is old or not large enough or whatever. I can understand that 100%, but it would be a mistake to give into it, because if that person then writes this new app and you want to maintain it and they leave, then the entire team has a problem. And this is not only for frameworks. Like in the beginning, I was like, okay, a front-end developer, he has to be able to write all of the frameworks. But the frameworks became so powerful that there are terms like React developer and Vue developer, simply because the frameworks are like, they have their own kind of language, and you should know them ideally if you join a front-end developer team. A good front-end developer is still able to learn all of them, but still people have preferences and all of that. But it's a rule for the entire code base, for the entire developer team. If like someone wants to write a microservice in Go or in Rust, that's cool if the rest of the team is on board and is like supports that. And I think as a CTO, one needs to define a set of programming languages that are, allowed at the company and allowed to test out, and that are supported and that we will hire for, and the rest we don't. Because if you have a zoo of programming languages and libraries and best practices and things to do, like things are very hard to sync, things are very hard to find the right people to support, and you cannot switch around people, and you don't want your technology to stay in your way. All of the programming language will solve 99.99% of all the things you want to do as a business and of all businesses that exist. It does, like, you don't need Rust or Go or React versus Vue. It's just preference. And there are a few very, very small edge cases where you get to the limits of Node or the limits of Vue or whatever. So it's a personal preference, and in my opinion, it should be decided once, and then the company just sticks to it and ships. And only if there is a very, very tough like downside, you can migrate away from that. For example, from Java to Node or whatever, something like this. But as long as you find developers for it, it's you shouldn't make that effort, or just as a hobby. You're wasting time if you do that.
Yeah, I think we slowly have to wrap up. There's still so many questions in terms of what you think of the future of the Vue ecosystem, maybe what's missing from your point of view, if you have tried out the Nuxt 4 migration, the breaking changes yet, and so on. But I'm more than sure that we'll have you on soon again in the DejaVue podcast if you're inclined to join us one more time.
Definitely.
Perfect.
Definitely.
I mean, it's like going on for almost 2 hours here, raw recording. So it was a lot of fun. I think we all learned a lot from a business side and from a technical point of view. And of course, there's one more last question. Sumit, where can people follow you all around your bootstrapping story, all around Parquet? Share everything you want to share with us right now.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for having me. This was really fun. Okay. I share most of what I do and how I do it on Twitter. So you can follow me at tweets of Sumit. That is my username pattern. I use it everywhere. Videos of Sumit is the YouTube channel, of course. And I also run a podcast, currently not that active, but I will get back to it soon. That is called Minimal Empires. That one is in German, though. It's also on the YouTube channel and focused on bootstrapping and building a business. Yeah, so these are the main channels. I'm on most of the social networks as well, but on Twitter I share most of the stuff. Instagram is private, and I'm also on Blue Sky and stuff like this. But Twitter is the main one. Yeah, that's it, I think. And of course, if you're German and a finance nerd, you can also check out Parquet, also on YouTube, and I'm live there every Friday as well. But that is probably very low overlap in audiences.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of German listeners, actually, according to our stats. So, yeah. And
Nice.
why not? So, yeah, Sumit, thank you so much. Links, of course, to all of that in the show notes / description, so you won't miss out. You don't have to live type it. So don't worry about that.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. And for everyone who didn't listen to all the episodes before, please check them out. We had mentioned some of them, like with Evan, for example. We had some with Daniel Rowe, with other Nuxt core team members, Vue core team members that we mentioned along the road. And yeah, definitely give them a listen. And if that's not the latest episode, then quickly jump to the next one and continue. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned, and hear you all / see you all soon.